Good evening. It's a great pleasure to be here, and thank you all for coming this evening. In the talk tonight, I would like to try and address from various angles the statement I made in the title of the talk, which is a kind of a question but also an answer. Is Palestine still the issue in 2016? You can either read it with an exclamation mark or with a question mark, but I hope that we will spend some time here thinking about it together, pondering about this question. The academic work on Palestine until recent years, especially in the departments of history, politics, social sciences, did not produce any new thinking about the question of Palestine. In fact, if you looked for new ideas of how to push forward peace, justice, and reconciliation in Palestine, you had to look elsewhere, not to the academia, but to the civil society. NGOs, groups of activists, pundits, committed persons were far more innovative and far more pioneering in their thinking than academics were about the issue of Palestine. It is in those circles that the depiction of Israel as an apartheid state was courageously put forward as an option. It is there that the idea that Israel should be treated like apartheid South Africa was first introduced, which led to the very successful and effective boycott, divestment, and sanction movement, the BDS movement. And it is there where people were talking for the first time in a very convincing and significant way of alternatives to the failed peace process. Academics were not very good in offering any alternative to what the politicians have offered as the way forward. But recently, the academia has succeeded, I think, coming back with some fresh paradigms and ideas which will feed activism, I think, in the future. So that's a very positive development when you think that academics are not stuck in ivory towers and have some relationship to the reality around them. And by what I refer to here, and I think is one way of answering the question, I hope we will see the connection very soon, is one way of answering the question whether Palestine is still the issue in 2016. What I mean is that in recent years, academics who write about Palestine, who research Palestine and Israel, have used an old paradigm that was forgotten when it was first introduced in the 1960s by some French sociologists. But they rehashed it, they repackaged it as an effective paradigm. And this is the settler colonialist paradigm. Unfortunately, we have lost 10 days ago one of the most exciting academics who brought to the fore the settler colonialist paradigm in general, and the one that dealt with Palestine in particular, Patrick Wolf. But he really, in his short period on this earth, he succeeded in leaving us a very significant legacy. And I'm very happy that his last book came out while he was still alive, and he could see the impact that book had on academics all over the world. Why is the settler colonialist paradigm so important? Why is it so important to talk about settler colonialism with regard to Palestine? In order to understand the significance of this paradigm, you have to think of the paradigm that is hegemonic, the one that still prevails as the main academic, and not only academic, perspective on the conflict in Palestine. If you talk to mainstream media, if you talk to mainstream academia, if you talk to politicians, doesn't matter where they are, Palestine is not analyzed as a settler colonialist reality. It is analyzed as a conflict between two national movements. It's a conflict between two national movements, and therefore the solution is a compromise between two national movements. Two national movements fighting for the same country, hence probably have the same right and attachment to that country. And since the most important academic centers that deal with conflicts in general, and with Palestine in particular, are here in the United States, it's not surprising that this paradigm is informed by ideas that emanate in the world of business and fair trade. So, in the words of one of the former American Secretary of States, Madeleine Albright, if you want to solve a conflict like the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, you should make everything which is visible divisible and forget about the invisible aspects of the conflict, because they are indivisible. And if they are indivisible, if you cannot partition them, they are not conducive to peace. What she meant by invisible aspects was issues such as justice, morality, the right of the refugees to return. These were all invisible aspects. What is divisible? Land, water, security, sovereignty. These are the four elements. And it's not surprising that with the despair of years of struggle for liberation that did not produce liberation, quite a few Palestinians were willing to go along eventually with this paradigm. I don't think they ever believed in that paradigm, but they were willing to take this paradigm. And the academia was very powerful, or played a very powerful role in producing knowledge about this paradigm. Namely, the role of the academia is to tell the politicians, we did the research that proves scientifically that your ideological positions are correct. In previous times, that's what priests did with their connection to God. They gave a message from God that ideology was okay. Now it's the role of professors to tell politicians that they are scientifically sound. So, if you want to understand the importance and significance of settler colonialism, you have to understand that it challenges the paradigm of a national conflict in Palestine. Now, the United States of America is a very good place to talk about settler colonialism. People probably know about settler colonialism in this country. But for those who don't know what settler colonialism is, it's very different from colonialism. These are people who left Europe because Europe was a place they could not live in anymore. They really had to leave Europe. These are not people dispatched by empires to colonize so that the empires would grow and extend. These were really people who were running for their life. Whether they were Jews, Huguenots, Puritans or people living in Protestant areas of Germany during the religious wars. It doesn't matter. People had to look for a safe haven. So they were actually buying a one-way ticket. And they settled in someone else's homeland, where they thought not only to build a home, but also to make the home a homeland. With only one small problem, of course, that the homeland was inhabited by another people. And in many cases, as Patrick Wolf says so clearly in his brilliant work, in many ways, the encounter with the indigenous native people led to what he called the logic of elimination. There was no way of creating a new homeland for Christian or Jewish refugees from Europe without demolishing, destroying, eliminating the indigenous people. And that's what made settler colonialism so different from colonialism. Colonialists went back home. Settler colonialists made the new place their home. There were few case studies which were a bit exceptional, in which the logic of elimination did not mean necessarily a genocide of the indigenous people. Two case studies spring to one's mind in this context: South Africa and Palestine. The settler colonialist project in South Africa was not based on genocide. It was based on a much more sophisticated way of encountering indigeneity. Eventually, we know that it chose apartheid as its main tool, but long before apartheid was institutionalized, interestingly enough in 1948, long before that happened, ethnic cleansing, dispossession, ghettoizing people in enclaves, in kind of huge open prison camps, was part of the project of settler colonialism in South Africa. And when that project, at least politically, came to an end in the 1990s, one could see also what settler colonialism looks like when the native people have not been annihilated, and there is a new agreement between the settlers and the natives. What you had in South Africa was a new political agreement between the settlers and the indigenous people. On the one hand, equal rights to the natives. On the other hand, recognition of the settlers as natives. The second case study is Palestine. Jews colonized Palestine as part of a settler colonialist project. In fact, the irony of this statement is that the early Zionists had no problem in describing themselves as settler colonialists, because the public relationship of settler colonialism in the late 19th century was quite good. Colonizing other people, settling in their homeland, was seen as part of enlightenment, as part of modernity, as part of progress. So Herzl proudly talked about colonizing Palestine. He proudly talked about the Jewish settlements in Palestine as colonies. But today in Israel, if you want to teach a course, maybe even in Yale, looks a bit like Israel, if you want to teach a course called Colonialism, Zionism as Colonialism, the best that can happen to you is that you will be called an anti-Semite. And that's the best. although you are really using the discourse of the people themselves. Now, of course, today Israel doesn't feel comfortable with this depiction, because the public relationship of colonialism has changed. It doesn't look like a positive ideology anymore, and settler colonialism in particular doesn't look like an attractive project you want to be identified with. But it is. Israel is the only lasting, existing settler colonialist project. It's still a project. It has not been completed. Had it been completed, we would have had a very different talk tonight about the Palestinians. Thank God it has not been completed. Because if Patrick Wolf is right, there is a logic of a settler colonialist project, a logic of elimination that you don't want to see in the case of Palestine being implemented in full. Why is it not implemented? First and foremost, because of the Palestinian resistance, because of the Palestinian steadfastness. Secondly, because of the international community support for the Palestinians. So it's not for the lack of willingness on the side of the settler colonialist project to complete its objective that settler colonialism as a project has not come to an end. It is because there are obstacles in implementing it. The biggest moment, or the biggest historical chance, the historical window that could have been used for implementing dramatically the settler colonialist project of Zionism was 1948. And it took some time for the academic community to realize that actually, contrary to both the Israeli narrative and the liberal Zionist narrative, it was not the war of 1948 that produced the refugee problem. It was not, the refugees did not become refugees in Palestine because there was a war. In fact, half of them became refugees before the war even started. The war was the means to implement the settler colonialist logic of elimination. Elimination doesn't always mean physical annihilation. You can eliminate the people by expelling them. You can eliminate the people by not allowing them to leave their villages. You can eliminate people by wiping them out of historical narrative. The 21st century began, at least, with more sophisticated means of elimination, but in an horrendous way, the Zionist logic of elimination was emulated in the last 6 or 7 years by other groups in the Middle East, again bringing it to a physical elimination. Groups like the Islamic State. And I think there is a connection between the example that Zionism gave to the Arab world, or to certain groups, I should say, in the Arab world, about the logic of elimination that can be legitimized by the West, and the logic of elimination that could be legitimized by religion or any other ideology. Because the logic of elimination that in 1948 brought what I called in my book the project of the ethnic cleansing of Palestine, the expulsion of half of Palestine's population out of the homeland, the destruction of half of Palestine's villages and towns. This project of elimination, or the logic of elimination that produced this project, has another logic in it. And that's the importance, another importance of the settler colonialist paradigm. What can cause a group of people who were themselves refugees, who ran away themselves from persecution, from death, from famine, What can cause people who were themselves victims of human brutality, what can cause them to become so swiftly victimizers who do the very same things that had been done to them? What makes the abused child into an abuser in such a short period of time? And the answer is very clear, as the research on settler colonialism shows very powerfully in the case of Australia and New Zealand, here in North America and South America. In order to be able to do this, you need to dehumanize the native. You cannot kill children. You cannot expel people from their villages. You cannot destroy a whole society unless you don't regard it as a human society, especially if your departure point is not an imperial power, not a state power. Your departure point, and that's what's so important about settler colonialism, you are yourself a victim. You are a victim. So you can't, you're not moved by ideologies of power. That's why Zionism has nothing to do with nationalism in this respect. But you have to dehumanize in order to justify doing to someone else what you claim had been done to you. So the Palestinians are the victims of the Holocaust. And the victims of the Holocaust were doing to the Palestinians exactly what had been done to them. And to do that in every phase of history, you have to dehumanize those you exterminate, those you expel, those you destroy. And I come back to the Middle East today. Part of the horrific things we are seeing in Syria, particularly in Syria, but not only in Syria, is not just a logic of elimination, it's the logic of dehumanization. But we keep forgetting that the major project of elimination and dehumanization was Zionism, long before it was exercised in such a brutal force as we have seen recently in the Middle East. And it's not only that dehumanization and elimination was exercised by Zionism against the Palestinians that is the importance of Palestine today. It's the fact that it was internationally legitimized as part of democracy, progress, and modernity, which I think drives everyone mad in the Middle East. Because people can fully understand condemnation of mass murder, of destroying of cities, of villages, of expelling of people, whether it's in Iraq or Syria or Yemen, Libya. People can fully understand it. What they cannot understand is why in this list of present and past atrocities, you will never find Gaza. You will never find the city of Ramallah in 2002. You will never find Beirut of 1982. You will never find Deir Yassin of 1948. That's what people are asking themselves. And the answer is, you won't find it there, not just because Jews did it, and in all the other cases, Muslims did it, although it's not always Muslims, that other people are involved in this as well. The main reason that you won't find these dehumanizations and eliminations of human beings in that list is that Zionism was regarded by its own founders and by the Western society as part of enlightenment, as was the genocide of the Native Americans, as was the genocides of Aboriginals. It's part of enlightenment. All the big philosophers of enlightenment justified genociding indigenous people. It's amazing. Read every one of them. There is not one of them who condemns the elimination of native people. And these are the people who are the foundation of the morality of the West. It's incredible. Not one of them condemned genocides. Not out of ignorance. Because these were not humans. And Zionism was on the very last moment of this period. And the world was a bit suspicious, one should say, to its credit. Really, are the Palestinians aboriginals that could be hunted and killed? Or are the Palestinians something else? Do they belong to actually to the Indians and the people in Africa who are actually waging a legitimate war of liberation? Zionism manipulated so well the Holocaust and Europe's guilt about the Jewish problem to make sure that, at least in practice, maybe not in discourses, but at least in practice, the world would treat the Palestinians or would view the Palestinians in the same way that it viewed the Maoris in New Zealand, the Aboriginals in Australia, and the Native Americans in this country. And this logic, or these twin logics of elimination and dehumanization, continue to be exercised in Palestine today. Yes, they don't have the magnitude of the elimination and the dehumanization of Syria, of the Syrian theater of war, if you want, where everybody, it doesn't matter whom, thinks that they can contribute to peace by bombarding from the air. This is kind of a Western logic that always evaded me. How can you really create peace in Syria by dropping more bombs on the civilian population? A supposedly leftist Labour leader in the British Parliament, whose father, I think, is still turning in the grave after hearing his son's speech in the House of Commons, Hilary Benn, was likened to Churchill because he gave a powerful speech in favor of Britain participating in this orgy of bombing people in Syria from the air, as if this shows that this man was above his comments, that he was another Churchill fighting against Nazism. People are losing their minds when it comes to Syria. It's just unbelievable. It doesn't matter whether they come from Moscow, Turkey, Riyadh, London, or Washington. They all like to see their air forces employ their latest lethal weapons against the poor Syrian people in the name of bringing peace and reconciliation to the torn land of Syria. Israel was using similar tactics when it bombed Ramallah in 2002, Gaza in 2006. Britain and America claimed that they were raining democracy on Iraq and Afghanistan with F-16 and Tomahawk rockets in 2003. So the logic of elimination and dehumanization is not only happening in Palestine, it's very clear. And it's not happening in the most worst form in Israel and Palestine. It's true, especially in the last few years. You cannot compare if one wants to deal with this business of comparing atrocities. But there are two issues that we have to keep in mind here. First of all, that the logic of elimination and dehumanization in the case of Palestine is 100 years old, not 4 years old. It's 100 years old. And therefore you don't compare what happened in the last 4 years in Palestine to the last 4 years in Syria. You compare what happened in the last 4 years in Syria to what happened in the last 100 years in Palestine. And then you can understand also the connection. And the second thing we have to bear in mind is that the reasons, not by any means the only reasons, but some of the most important reasons for the dismembering of the Arab nation states, for the kind of violence that erupted in 2011 and still we don't know how long it will continue to erupt, whether it's by the regimes or by people who counter the regimes or by people who come from the outside claiming they're helping either the regimes or the opposition, that this violence, one of the main reasons for this violence, and as I say, not the exclusive reason, but the very important reason, is the political structure that Britain and France had constructed after the First World War, especially in the eastern part of the Middle East, the Mashriq. An area which the Ottoman Empire, with all its faults, and it had many faults, was far more respectful of collective identities, of religious sensitivities, and even did never consider pitting one group against the other as means of keeping control. But Western colonial powers are great believers in divide and rule, and therefore aggravated probably existing tensions, but aggravated tensions that were not solved by the creation of nation state, could not have been solved by the creation of nation state. And unfortunately, humanity needs a very cruel reminder to come back to the drawing map or drawing table to rebuild political systems where political systems failed humanity. I'm not saying that the exercise will end by dismembering all the Arab nation states. I don't know. Maybe some of the nation states will remain the way they are. But it's definitely a period of transition which will end with a very different kind of a political structure or infrastructure. But it's very important to remember what part of that very badly constructed nation-state system was the worst as far as the indigenous people were concerned, or the native people of the Middle East were concerned. This was Palestine. It was one thing, it was bad enough to tell the people of Iraq that they want a Hashemite king, and do a referendum in 1920 that showed that 99.9% of the people of Iraq wanted Faisal as king of Iraq. That's bad enough. But at least Iraq goes to the Iraqis. Okay, the king is a foreigner, but he's at least from the region, right? It's something else to take a whole country that does not belong to you and to give it to someone else it doesn't belong to. And included in what is called the Big Peace after the First World War. And institutionalize it and ground it in the League of Nations and later on in the United Nations. Even that was not enough, because some of the people who supported the idea of a Jewish state in Palestine, to their credit at least one should say historically, really thought that it's all about a safe haven for Jews, and therefore should not really be a big problem. Eventually, knowing who the Palestinians were, knowing the hospitality of the Arab world, it would have worked eventually. These are poor Jews from Europe. The Arabs would eventually allow them to settle in, which is exactly how the first Zionists were accepted in Palestine. But they haven't read Patrick Wolf's book. They couldn't. It was published 70 years later. The very basic idea of a settler colonialist movement is not rejoicing because they are hospitable natives. In fact, hospitable natives are even worse than alien natives, because hospitable natives give you a moment where you are torn between your humanity and inhumanity. I remember one of the most powerful passages I read in the diaries of the early Zionist settlers was a kind of a confession by a Zionist settler saying, at the moment of weakness, I thought that the Palestinian farmer is like us. But my leaders told me I was wrong and I could see the light. And I'm sure it happened here as well. I'm sure it happened in Australia as well, in New Zealand as well. Not all human beings can that easily become inhuman or dehumanize other people in such a way. But that passage showed you how even troubled people eventually succumb to the logic of elimination. And that is the main problem in Palestine. There's a famous correspondence between Mahatma Gandhi and Martin Buber, the Jewish philosopher who supported Zionism. The leaders of the Zionist movement asked Martin Buber to try and recruit Mahatma Gandhi to support the Zionist project. They knew that Gandhi, who was still a lawyer in South Africa, was quite hostile to the idea of Zionism. So they tried to elicit a letter of support from him. And Gandhi wrote back to Buber saying, you know, if I would be convinced that all you want as a group of Jews who came from Europe is to live alongside the Palestinian community, I would support you. But I have a bad feeling that you want to live instead of them. And this I could never support. This is why until today we don't even have any street named after Gandhi in Israel. Not even a small alley or a cave. So, Israel today is a settler colonialist state. Is it still motivated by logics of elimination and dehumanization when it comes to the Palestinians? The answer is yes. Is that logic so different from the logic of the violent groups who tear the Middle East apart? No, it's the same logic. It's not donned in the same discourse. It is not spoken in with the same ideological vocabulary, but it's the same human impulse to eliminate another human. Is there any connection between a Western world or a reality in which the international community would end the exceptionalism that Israel enjoys, its particularly impunity, and the end of violence in Syria and Iraq? I think there is. I think there is a very strong connection between the chances of bringing peace and justice to the places which are now experiencing carnage and human suffering on an unimaginable magnitudes, and the international position on Palestine. And I would say, and with this I would end, that for those of us who still, for understandable reasons, think that the paradigm of the two national movements is the right one, and therefore support the two-state solution, I can understand where it comes from, and I can hope that maybe people who support this idea may be still right and it's still possible. But I think it's very, very important to understand, at least, if not from the Palestinian perspective, what does it mean from the Zionist perspective? Namely, what is the connection between the two-state solution and settler colonialism? And with this I will end, because I think that's very important. From a settler colonialist perspective, allowing the natives to have 20% of Palestine, which is what the two-state solution is all about, and divide these 20% into two Bantustans in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, and keep an eye on the passage between them, and claim at the same time to be the only democracy in the Middle East and the harbinger of peace, is something that people in South Africa were dreaming of but could not convince the world of accepting. That there is something called liberal apartheid. That's liberal Zionism, diet Zionism, if you want. And I think that's what's so frustrating about the discussions we have about the possible solution about Palestine. That there are genuine supporters of the two-state solution who are genuinely motivated by ideas of justice, national independence for the Palestinians, and realpolitik. But this is genuine. This is not a cynical support. But I think because they refuse to apply the paradigm of settler colonialism with its two logics to Israel and Zionism, they fail to see the mountain that they have to climb, and instead are looking at a hill that has very little to do with their problems, but is climbable. So I hope that at least in the academic world we'll continue to discuss alternative paradigms, because frankly, what politicians have done so far, mainstream academics have done so far, mainstream journalists have done so far, is using a paradigm that explains to them why there is a conflict, why there's no peace, or what should be the solution. That kind of paradigm. It always reminds me of the Jewish joke about the people who lost the key and looked for it where there was light, but not where they lost the key. So it's time to turn off the light for these people, and then again look for the place where the key was lost. Thank you very much.